Just like the Americans had been ignoring it, just like the Israelis had been ignoring it. It turns out that, the only people not ignoring it were the Palestinians, and that's ultimately why you got October 7th. I mean, it's very clear, as long as this war is going on, they're going to keep doing it. And this is disrupting shipping. Hamas has any concern about any civilians. They have an ideology that treats civilians as expendable.
Hi everyone, this is Sukanya Saha and you're watching Hindustan Times. Our today's guest is very special. He's Mr. Ian Bremmer, the president and founder of Eurasia Group. He's also a political scientist who helps business leaders, policymakers, and the general public make sense of the world around him. He's also the president and founder of Jazeera Media and an independent voice on critical issues around the globe. Today, he'd be speaking to us about the Israel-Hamas conflict, Iran's role in it, the US's efforts in brokering a ceasefire, and the future of Gaza, which currently is devastated beyond recognition. Hi, Ian. Welcome to the show.
Hi, happy to be with you.
So Hamas attacked Israel on October 7 and killed about 1,200 people, mostly civilians, and seized over 250 hostages, according to Israeli tallies. Israel then launched a counterattack on Gaza, which, according to the Hamas-run health ministry, has killed over 34,000 people so far. So, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu has promised to invade Rafah with or without a ceasefire deal. In fact, they've already launched an assault on Rafah. So, what do you think will be the implications of this on the broader Middle Eastern region?
Well, the Americans have delivered an ultimatum to Netanyahu, saying that there will be strong consequences if they proceed with such a war, if it is a full-scale ground invasion, and if we do not have contingencies allowing the Palestinians living there to reach safety. So you are correct that the prime minister, since the week before Ramadan, has been saying that a war in Rafah is imminent, and it hasn't yet happened. And that's like almost 2 months now. But there's a lot of space between him launching a war and him launching a war with some of the contingencies that would make it more acceptable or less unacceptable, maybe a better way of putting it, to the Biden administration. Look, I do believe that some form of military operation is inevitable because this isn't just Netanyahu, it's not just the war cabinet, it's the entire Israeli population. They believe that the war in Gaza is fully justified by the attacks on October 7th by Hamas. They believe that the killings of Palestinian civilians are the responsibility of Hamas for operating in those civilian areas and for refusing to release the hostages that they continue to hold. And they fully support continued military strikes into Gaza until the military infrastructure is destroyed, the leadership is captured or killed, the hostages are released, and the tens of thousands of fighters are gone. And that is not a position that is supported by almost anyone else in the world, but almost all the Israelis support it.
So, in light of Secretary Blinken's efforts to broker a hostage for ceasefire deal, what role do you see the US playing in resolving the crisis, particularly regarding negotiations with Hamas, especially since Biden is facing massive protests across US college campuses like Columbia, Yale, etc.?
Look, this is a really challenging policy for the US president. He is isolated on the global stage. Almost no country supports the US position on the war as the strongest ally in the world for Israel. And it's quite unpopular in the United States. Majority of Americans increasingly want a ceasefire. And young people and a majority of Democrats are more aligned with the Palestinian position on the war than they are with Israel. So very different from what you've seen from the United States in previous decades. Now, Biden is certainly trying very hard, first, to prevent the Israeli war cabinet from launching a ground war into Rafah, where 1.5 million Palestinians are presently sheltering, worrying that it's going to be a bloodbath, perhaps even worse than what we've seen over the last 7 months. And at the same time, Biden is trying really hard to facilitate these hostages to be released, at least some of them. And they've also been held now for 7 months. And we're talking about a lot of civilians. It's not just military targets. And they've been held illegally, many of them tortured by Hamas. And they refuse to budge despite the efforts and the negotiations. And it is almost impossible to get a temporary ceasefire unless we have a breakthrough there. So those are the two most immediate challenges in an environment where this war is, at least right now, continuing to get worse.
So the Biden administration has emphasized the importance of a long-term political solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right? In your opinion, what steps can be taken to advance towards such a solution, like a two-state solution, or what role could neighboring Arab nations play in this process?
Look, it's very helpful to have the Gulf states recognize that we need to have a solution for the Palestinians. They'd been ignoring that for years, just like the Americans had been ignoring it, just like the Israelis had been ignoring it. It turns out that the only people not ignoring it were the Palestinians, and that's ultimately why you got October 7th. Now, I think it's a good thing that the Saudis are engaging with the Americans to talk about not only some level of improved military cooperation and upgrading of their alliance with the U.S., but also being willing to officially accept normalization of relations with Israel if there is an Israeli commitment to a Palestinian state and a clear, defined path to achieve that. Now, that's a great pathway to peace, except that the Israeli government is unprepared to end the military fighting. And the Israeli prime minister, even after the fighting is over, at some point refuses to accept a two-state solution. So we have to not only get to a point where a permanent ceasefire can be declared, and we're not close to that yet, but we also need the Israeli prime minister out of office. And that might be coming within 6 months. It's possible. There's a lot of pressure on him, but it might not be. And I can't see any peace when the sitting leader of Israel refuses to accept a two-state solution.
How do you view the challenges faced by both the Biden administration because of the massive protests across US and Netanyahu? The Israeli citizens have also held huge demonstrations across the nation. We know about that. So what challenges do you think both these leaders face in navigating domestic and international pressures surrounding the Israel-Hamas conflict? Also, what strategies do you believe they should employ moving forward? And how do you anticipate domestic dynamics influencing Israel's approach to resolving the crisis?
These two leaders can't stand each other. Netanyahu wants Trump to win, and Biden wants Netanyahu out. And it's not clear who has more leverage over the other right now, given that, Netanyahu faces massive domestic instability and opposition. And Biden is right now behind in the polls versus Trump. We could be in a situation in 6 months' time where neither of these leaders are gonna have a future. That's certainly possible, but it's very hard. Biden probably needed to be much stronger in opposing Netanyahu than he has been over the last months. He looks weak, Biden, on Israel-Palestine. He's demanded a two-state solution, and the leader of Israel has said absolutely not. He has demanded that there not proceed with a Rafah ground invasion, and Netanyahu said, I'm going to do it no matter what. Now, this is the same leader that the Americans have just committed $17 billion of additional military aid for, right? This is the same leader that is accountable for the killings of hundreds of aid workers, including American citizens, in Gaza over the past months, after committing to the Americans that everything possible is being done to protect these people. He's the same leader that has refused to allow in humanitarian aid. You can imagine that, Biden, who is the elected president of the most powerful country in the world's only superpower, with a military that can project power all over the world in a way that no other country can, that this leader is having the Israeli prime minister basically walk all over him. And you can imagine that that does not play off well domestically in the US. He looks weak to the Republicans, and he looks like he's in Israel's pocket to the Democrats. So no one's happy with Biden's policy in the United States right now on the Middle East.
Ian, so you mentioned about Trump. Now, if a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas fails to materialize, and Trump, who has called this conflict a PR war, returns to office, what might the future of the war look like?
Look, Trump is going to be a huge friend of Israel, and Trump's advisors on the Middle East are very supportive of the far right in Israel and their political position. Trump personally does not like or trust the Israeli prime minister, and I think Trump would be very happy to see him go. Some of it's kind of funny. It's because Netanyahu was one of the first leaders to call Biden to congratulate him on his electoral victory over Trump. And of course, Trump continues to say that that election was stolen. So he's angry about that. But he's also angry that when the Americans decided to assassinate Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Iranian military, that the Israelis had told Trump that they were going to do this together. And then a week before, Netanyahu decided that he wasn't going to. And Trump is angry about that too. So I think the individual relationship between these men is problematic, but the ideological orientation of Trump is very much towards the far right and towards Netanyahu's support base. Remember, it was Trump that moved the embassy to Jerusalem. It was Trump that did the recognition of the Golan Heights as part of Israel. It was Trump who has been instrumental in getting the Abraham Accords done, normalizing Israeli relations with several Arab states. So at the end of the day, there's no surprise that that's who the Israeli government presently wants.
So now Iran has directly joined the war. How do you assess Iran's involvement in the Israel-Hamas conflict, and what impact could it have on regional stability? Even though Iran, we know, is entirely on Hamas's side, do you think Iran could also broker a truce fire between Israel and Hamas?
It's hard to imagine. I think that Qatar is the more important country here. They're the ones that are actually acting as negotiators. The Hamas political leadership is presently located in Doha, which obviously makes that easier. But Iran's role in the war has been as the leader, the funder, the trainer of the so-called axis of resistance. A number of organizations in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, in Lebanon, in the occupied territories, and now apparently in Bahrain as well, a new organization that's recently popped up. And these are all organizations that do not recognize the right of Israel to exist. They are considered terrorist organizations by Israel and by the United States. And Iran is providing them with money and weapons and intelligence. So as long as that continues, the potential for Iran to get directly involved in the war is high. I mean, they are clearly, they're waist deep in a proxy war, in a number of proxy wars across the Middle East. And after the Israelis engaged in direct strikes against an Iranian government building in Damascus, Iran hit Israel back with over 300 missiles and drones directly on Israeli territory. Now, fortunately, most of them didn't get through and no one was killed. But that was a big risk for the Iranians to take. And if that attack had been more successful, which the Iranians were clearly hoping for, then the Israelis would have responded with a much more significant military engagement, a strike against Iran. And we might be in a very different environment today. We could be talking about the Straits of Hormuz disrupted, the U.S. in a war against Iran, $150 oil. So, I mean, when we talk about Iran's involvement in this war, we're talking about the one thing that would really take this war and make it suddenly matter to everyone in the world, where right now it's really a regional conflict.
So, Ian, last year I'd spoken to Mr. Cliff Kupchan, who is the chairman of Eurasia Group, and he highlighted that Russia's alleged role in fueling conflict in the Middle East. Moreover, Russia has recently praised Iran for punishing Israel. So, in light of these developments, do you share the view that Russia has an interest in escalating tensions and potentially instigating a major conflict in the Middle East?
Yeah, I don't think that they're a principal participant, but I think that they certainly benefit from the chaos. They support disinformation efforts and cyber attacks, and Iran is a principal ally of Russia, and there's a lot of technology transfer. The Iranians are doing more than anyone else, even North Korea, to help the Russians in their war against Ukraine. And the Russians appreciate that and are providing a lot of money, but also a lot of technology to the Iranians, who otherwise are very technologically challenged because of all of the sanctions that have been against them for such a long period of time. So, yeah, I worry about that. More broadly, Russia's influence on the ground is more significant in the Sahel, in countries like Niger and Chad and Burkina Faso, where we've recently had military coups, and the Russians are literally on the ground providing paramilitary support for these new illegitimate governments. That's where the Russians have a lot more influence directly on the ground. The influence they have in the Middle East is more indirect.
Right. So, what are your thoughts on the recent warnings from experts suggesting that the Houthis may target some more ships beyond the Red Sea, potentially jeopardizing exports?
I mean, it's very clear, as long as this war is going on, they're going to keep doing it. And this is disrupting shipping. It's a security threat. And some of those attacks have been against American military vessels. And if they get through and if they kill some American sailors, you're going to see a very significant American response. So the Houthis are absolutely a disruptive factor here. And unlike the proxies of Iran in Syria and Iraq, the Houthis are more autonomous from Iran. They clearly have a lot of operational control of what they're doing, and Iran is providing support, but it's not clear that Iran would be effective at constraining them if they really wanted to.
So, Blinken recently said that Hamas rejecting a deal would demonstrate a lack of concern for Palestinians. Do you think the assertion holds true? Because a lot of innocent people, including children, died in the war, and Hamas has expressed deep concern regarding the suffering of Palestinian people at several occasions.
I think that there is no justification to believe Hamas has any concern about any civilians. They have an ideology that treats civilians as expendable for the achievement of their political goals, and they've treated Israeli civilians that way, and they're treating Palestinian civilians that way. And I mean, I don't think anybody in the world today can say that Hamas does not bear responsibility for civilian deaths in Gaza. I also think that not anyone in the world today can say that Israel does not bear responsibility for civilian deaths in Gaza. We can talk about who's more responsible, who's less. I happen to think that Hamas is more responsible, Israel is less, but I think they both have responsibility. They both have responsibility. And I think that a ceasefire is required precisely for that reason. And further, an immediate release of the hostages is required for precisely that reason. Unfortunately, we have the Israelis and Hamas today both engaged in a war that they are not taking responsibility for civilian casualties. They're not. And that is a horrible, horrible thing to have happen in the 21st century.
So, do you think will Gaza ever recover? If yes, what would it take to rebuild Gaza after the war?
I don't think that Gaza will recover in the near future. I have a hard time seeing it. I think what we have now in the last 7 months is we are radicalizing a generation of Palestinians against Jews, and we're radicalizing a generation of Jews against Palestinians. And that's going to lead to a lot more violence, a lot more hatred. This is the one thing I don't understand about the Israeli position. I mean, the Hamas wants that radicalization. That's good for Hamas. The Israelis shouldn't want that. The Israelis need to learn the lesson from 9/11, which President Biden said at the beginning of this war. You know, the Americans fought this war against terror, and it was a lot worse for everybody after decades and trillions of dollars were spent. And I worry that despite all of the efforts of Israel to target every last member of Hamas and their military capabilities, they will end up with much more anti-Israel radicalization, much more anti-Semitism because of the war than they would have if they had fought it in a much, much more restrained way. No one was saying they couldn't respond. They had to respond. They couldn't just sit after October 7th. They had to go after, they had to get their hostages out. They had to attack Hamas leadership. But 7 months later, no one can say Israel is safer because of this war. It's not true. It's not true. And they are making a very grave mistake in the way they're fighting this war.
Thank you for watching us, guys. Have a nice rest of the day.